There's a $1 trillion industry that's paid to be wrong. And that's venture capital. It's a unique breed of investors that back high-growth companies at their earliest stages. Apple, Airbnb, NVIDIA, they've all been backed by venture capitalists. The problem is, for every one Apple, there are thousands of companies that fail and die. In fact, working as an investor at SoftBank Vision Fund, I saw that the industry as a whole loses money on about half the bets we make. And we miss the mark 90% of the time. 90%. Can you imagine walking out of your exam with 10% of the answers? Or what happens when you come back from your vacation and 90% of the bags are missing? Despite these ridiculous failure rates, venture capitalists manage to make and move billions of dollars per year. And they do this with a single principle: asymmetric bets, where the few wins are massive and the many losses are capped. The founder of SoftBank, Masayoshi-son, actually became the richest person in the world for a brief moment using this exact principle. In the year 2000, Masa invests $20 million into a company called Alibaba. That $20 million turns into $100 billion. $20 million to $100 billion. To give you a little bit of perspective, if you put in $200 in that trade, you'd be a millionaire by now. And this is a closely held secret in the venture capital industry. But why is it important that I share this idea with you today? I think it matters because asymmetric bets is key to enable anyone to do extraordinary things without risking everything. It's how we maximize human potential, especially for people who can't afford to risk it all. I certainly couldn't. This is me and my sister. We come from a loving family, but we also come from an immigrant, low-income one in the middle of nowhere. It was to the point where we couldn't even afford broadband internet. So every Sunday morning, I would wake up and load up a single YouTube video before heading out to church. And by the time I came back, I would just hope I could watch a single video without interruptions. And I chose a sentimental story, but the reality was quite harsh. Even at a young age, I saw that it was expensive to be poor. Not just from a money perspective, but from a risk perspective. Let me give you an example. When it came time for me to apply to college, I had enough money to apply to just 2. So for both applications, I made it to schools where I was pretty certain I would get in. In contrast, many of my peers were a lot more ambitious, applying to schools like here at Stanford with much lower admission rates, because they had dozens of other applications going out for them. So at least on paper, I wasn't ambitious enough. I didn't take enough risk. And no risk means no reward. What I absolutely hate about this narrative is that it's not even true. If anything, I took more risk applying to 2 schools with everything I had than my peers who applied to dozens of schools with money left over. And here's how it felt for me. Imagine you walk up to a roulette table, and everybody around you pulls out a $100 bill. And you reach into your back pocket, and you come up with a wrinkled up dollar bill. You would need to win 7 times in a row just to be on equal footings as everybody else. Who's taking more risk here? And things really didn't get better either. Fast forward a few months, Everyone was celebrating getting into their dream schools and what dorms they're going to live in. But when I opened up my acceptance letter, my heart sank to the bottom of my stomach. The tuition dollar was a despairing amount to me. Then my brain started spinning with calculations. What if I took that summer job on my friend's farm? Or what if I get that referral to Tim Hortons? Should I work at a movie theater? Or maybe I can get a referral or work part-time more or take overnight shifts. What if I do this? What if? But no matter how hard I try to square the circle, no amount of part-time work as a high schooler could get me to that number. And if you're risk-averse and even risk-restricted like I was, maybe you felt the same frustration. You work incredibly hard, you do everything right, and you risk it all, but there's still no path forward. And that's how a part of human potential goes to die every single day. Things could have ended very differently for my story, but thankfully at that time I finally got access to that broadband internet. And other than the joys of watching YouTube videos without interruptions, I found out that there were hundreds of scholarships for people like me. And that would become the first of my asymmetric bets in my life. Let me explain this a little bit. Minimum wage in my province in Canada was $10 an hour. And a single scholarship could be worth as much as $10,000. That means winning just one scholarship is equivalent to me working 1,000 hours part-time. And when I saw this in action, I said, I'm going to devote all of my time into applying to as many scholarships as I can. And I ended up applying to about 120 of them. But here's the catch. I don't need all 120. I just need a few to work out for me to be able to go to school. So here's what happened after 400 hours of applying to scholarships. Despite a 90% rejection rate, I managed to win $80,000 worth of scholarships. That was more than enough for me to go to school and even support my family to some degree. But had I spent the same 400 hours working part-time, I would have made $4,000. That's a 20x difference. With the same 400 hours, I was able to create radically different outcomes. And I don't share this to brag about how great I am or how much scholarships I won, but I share this to show you a glimpse of how asymmetric bets can create extraordinary outcomes in very ordinary circumstances. Imagine you're now back at this roulette table, but you get to play with a special set of rules. Instead of betting in dollars, you can now start betting in pennies. And rather than a double or nothing, every time you win, you can walk away with a $100 bill in your hand. That's asymmetric bets. And it sounds almost too good to be true. It should be illegal, but it's powering a $1 trillion industry that's driving our innovation today. So here's my question to all of you in the audience. What if you could apply asymmetric principles in your life? Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, actually suggests we live this way. He says, optimize for being spectacularly right some of the time, and low stakes wrong a lot of the time. And that's exactly how I started to take my decisions. Put yourself in my shoes for a moment. I just went from a farm boy who couldn't afford anything to winning almost 6 figures in scholarships. I thought I found magic. And I started to apply this to everything I do, applying to hundreds of internships, conferences, jobs. I've even approached dating this way to some degree. But I was left frustrated with constant rejections and a few wins that never made up for it. I thought the magic stopped working. But fast forward a few years, I had just left my job at SoftBank, and I wanted to start my own company. And I approached the way I raised money this way. I spoke to hundreds of investors and managed to raise millions of dollars for my startup backed by Y Combinator. So it certainly seems to work sometimes and break other times. Why is that? Over the last decade, I've been experimenting with my own life to see why it works and why it doesn't. And I've come to 3 main conditions that allows asymmetric principles to play out in your life. And I'll demonstrate this with a live experiment I've been running that starts with the question, can I reach 1 billion people? And for an audacious goal like this, the way that I started is rather modest. It's something you can probably start before the end of this talk, and that's writing. When I started my company, the highs were extremely high, but the lows were soul-crushing. And writing became a coping mechanism for me to ground myself and stay sane. But because I was so busy, I couldn't be writing all the time. So I decided to take 1 Saturday out of the month. And I'd look forward to that day. That day, I would sleep in without any alarm, and I'd wake up in a great mood. I'd grab a cup of coffee, and then take a deep breath. Then I'd proceed to trauma dump all of my sadness and vulnerabilities and how much I suck. And all said and done, this translates to about 15 minutes a day. Something I could afford to do probably for the rest of my life if I wanted to. And that brings me to my first condition. Budget for a 90% failure rate. Asymmetric Bets assumes you can play this game hundreds of times. That means a single failure or even a series of failures shouldn't immobilize you. I've seen so many people and even companies give up after the first few flop because they haven't budgeted for this level of failure. You need to give luck enough time to catch up to you. And you can really start whether you've got a lot of resources or you're risk restricted. If you have $1, just start betting in pennies and not quarters. But of course, just writing and trauma dumping isn't enough to reach 1 billion people. At some point, I need to start sharing my ideas with other people, and that was petrifying to me. Not only because I talk about my vulnerabilities, like wanting to quit from time to time, asking myself if I'm even fit to be CEO. But what if people make fun of my stuff? There are founders who are far more successful than I am, and investors who made much more money than I ever did. What if they criticize my ideas? But my mental model to get over this came from breakfast burritos. I was sitting in a cafe over brunch in West Hollywood and sharing my concern, and my friend just looked up to me and said, "Daniel, you are the utmost expert in your own experience, and no one can challenge that." That stuck with me. And I did exactly that. I decided to write about my experience and then put it online. The second part of that sentence is really important, the online part of it. It's actually what allows every piece of my writing to have the potential and possibility to reach 1 billion people. And I did this by leveraging technology and infrastructure of other people. This brings me to my second condition. Position bets for 100x outcomes. 2x isn't enough. 5x isn't enough. when you expect to fail 90%, every single bet needs to be positioned for massive outcomes. And what's really sad is that many people position themselves where this is not a remote possibility. And what's interesting about these massive outcomes is that it has very little to do with how hard you work and everything to do with how you position yourself. Think back for a moment of how I got my education. The same 400 hours that I invested in scholarship created a life-changing outcome that I otherwise wouldn't have had I put that into part-time work. And if I bring this back to the live experiment, if there's any of you today who journals for 15 minutes, you're putting in just as much work as I am. The only difference is I put this online and started leveraging infrastructure that allowed me to scale my work to billions of people. And I'm not the only one who says this. Naval, the founder of AngelList, says, every single tweet costs nothing and has the potential to reach the entire world. It's the best lottery ever made. And that brings me to my third and final condition. It's actually what separates asymmetric bets from playing the lottery. And that's creating positive feedback loops. Every single one of your bets should be informing the other 99 bets. The probability of success of each of your bets aren't independent like a lottery ticket. They inform each other, and that creates a non-linear progression and improvement, and they start to stack on top of each other, eventually tilting the odds in your favor. When I finally mustered the courage to put my writing online, I was very happy to say no one made fun of my stuff. But that's not because I was a perfect writer. It's because no one's reading my stuff. But here's what changed for me internally. Every time I started to read, I started to analyze other writers' techniques. Every time I had a conversation, it became fuel for my writing. And every piece of writing just became a little bit better, stacking up and increasing the probability for any one of these to catch fire and eventually reach 1 billion people. And after about a year of doing this, Medium.com, a blogging platform, invited me to share my ideas at their first online conference. Little did I know the audience was an acquisition editor from one of the largest book publishers in the world. The day after my talk, as I was packing up to go to Japan, I got a DM on my LinkedIn. Loved your idea. Can we turn it into a book? 15 minutes. That's all it took. And with that publication of the book, that eventually led to the honor of sharing my ideas with everyone here today. It didn't take an enormous amount of work. It just took 15 minutes. Now, have I reached 1 billion people with the live experiment that I'm running? Being as risk-averse as I am, I wish I had a tiny, tidy conclusion that said, yes, this is exactly how I reached 1 billion people and became a best-selling author and won $1 million. But my live experiment is very much live, and that means it can still fail. But that's exactly the point. I can continue to invest 15 minutes a day and continue to write. I can write for as long as I want and budget for that 90% failure rate. And whether it's the stage, my book, or my future writing and interviews, every single one of my bets will be positioned for these 100x outcomes. And every time I do this, I'll just get a little bit better. And you can see how reaching 1 billion people and much more becomes just a matter of time. And these principles extend far beyond just my one live experiment, all the way to this trillion-dollar industry that's driving the innovation today. And the essence of asymmetric principles is this. Anyone can do extraordinary things without risking everything. And wherever you are in the journey, you can start today. Whether you resonated with the farm boy who had nothing but managed to break through and get an education, or an ex-venture capitalist who managed to raise millions of dollars to start a company and take his swing at changing the world. The exact same asymmetric principles can help you do extraordinary things in your life. And that's how we maximize human potential. Thank you.